Hi there, and welcome back to Season 2 of Cyburst, a podcast about science, popular culture, and entertainment. We're your hosts, Ella.
And Isabel, two science communicators and sci-fi nerds steering this spaceship alongside guests into the multiverse of science fun. Today's episode, sign language, science jargon, and representations on screen.
So exciting. This episode is going to be structured a little differently because today we have a very special guest, our friend, my housemate, and complete language connoisseur, Bailey Kennedy. Bailey, you want to say hi to everyone?
Hello.
Amazing. So excited to have you here. Before we dive into the topic and all the cool knowledge Bailey has about language across cultures, including popular culture, it's really important that we acknowledge the country this episode of Cyburst is being recorded on. Daura Nuna, Daura Nunawol. Yangu, Nalamanyin, Dunimanyin. Nunawol Wari, Dawa Wari, Dindi, Wangiralidjin Yin. This is Ngunnawal country. Today we are all meeting together on Ngunnawal country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders. And we would like to extend those respects to Ngambri peoples, to all country Cyburst is being listened to on, and also to any First Nations listeners out there. We acknowledge that Indigenous Australians are custodians of some of the oldest continuing languages in the world, and that there are over 250 Indigenous languages, including over 800 dialects, all of which are deeply rooted in people and place.
Thanks, Ella. Oh, that always sounds so beautiful.
Oh, I love it so much. Thank you to Tyrone and Jai for sharing that knowledge with me.
I think this is the first episode that you saying that in language.
Yeah, it is.
It's the first one. Yeah.
So exciting to be able to share that with everyone.
Yeah, so I think to kick us off, I'm going to give a little intro to our topic today. So today we're talking about language and particularly sign language, Auslan, and pop culture. So sign language, I think, is one of those things that hearing people like us became more widely aware of during the COVID pandemic, where we'd always have an interpreter next to the ministers or politicians giving updates on the status of things, and were communicating through sign language about scientific concepts. And interestingly, there's some fictional forms of sign language too that appear in some notable sci-fi and fantasy. Ones that come to mind are like Dune. There's also the Maidens of the Spear and Wheel of Time. And these forms of sign language are sort of used as a secret code in tricky situations. And there's plenty of other representations of sign language in pop culture that we'll get more into later and that Bailey has lots of knowledge on. So Ella is going to introduce Bailey, who has some pretty cool knowledge in this space.
So excited to introduce you, Bailey. So for people who don't have the pleasure of knowing Bailey, you're missing out. But Bailey is a recent graduate from the University of Western Sydney, finishing with a bachelor degree of design and technology. Whilst at university, Bailey received a New Colombo Plan scholarship and completed an internship in China. Following this, Bailey then studied with Deaf Connect for 2 years, completing a diploma in Auslan, which is Australian Sign Language. This is the second highest qualification in Auslan. Really cool. Bailey is a lover of language, loves the ways humans communicate, and that definitely includes popular media and culture. Bailey currently works in areas beloved by many nerds, retailing both video games and tea. And, very excitingly, Bailey is currently considering becoming a PhD student in the very near future.
Hello, it's so nice of you to have me. I'm so excited. Thank you for that glowing introduction. I did want to say at the top of the episode, while I have studied Auslan at length, and I have, as you said, I have the qualification that's directly below where you start learning how to be an interpreter, learning the content that you would need to have the NATI is what I haven't done, but everything up till there is what I've got. And I am a hearing person. This is not my language. I have had the privilege of studying with some very lovely deaf people who have shared their language with me through professional means with Deaf Connect, and I highly recommend that to anyone in Australia. They do online classes and stuff. Very, very cool. But I did want to give the disclaimer that this is not my language. and I am only peripherally joined by people in the deaf community. I am not part of it myself.
Yeah, super important to acknowledge that. And I guess also to begin this episode by chatting about, we are going to be talking about a language that is not a verbal language. So, you know, initially we're kind of, you know, in this space that hearing people have access to that deaf people don't necessarily, depending on their level of deafness.
Yeah. There's a whole big scale there that's not the topic of discussion. Yeah, generally speaking, Australian-born deaf people have some access to English, but whether or not that includes any hearing range at all is very, very person to person.
Yeah, so it's an absolute privilege to be talking about this topic today, and we want listeners to enjoy this conversation and to also just realize like who is excluded from this conversation. That's really important.
Yeah.
But kicking us off, Bailey, you have qualifications in communicating physically through design technology, verbally through university, and also visually through Auslan. What do you like about these three things that kind of links them all together? Because they seem a little bit diverse on the surface, but I'm sure they're way more connected than it first seems.
I am so excited to talk about this. One thing that stands out in the way that Auslan structures, I'm going to call them words for the purposes of the podcast because it's the easiest way to understand it. The way that Auslan structures words is so dependent on the receiver of the information having the context for that word. So there's words that when you first see the sign for it, you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Everyone started seeing the sign for COVID, which I'm fairly certain is pretty international at this point, which is not common, but it's a big one. And when you see the sign for COVID, you're like, oh, why does it look like that? You can Google it. It's very easy to find. And then you're like, oh, it looks like the shape of the bacteria that was being like shown around a lot. And you're like, that makes sense. So there's a lot of dependence on making sure that you know what is being, what's being communicated to you is like so important. And the whole language is structured around how do you communicate that the most efficiently, because obviously it can take more time to use your hands than your mouth comparatively language-wise. It feels very similar to like when you're studying, funnily enough, if you're doing like presentations, especially in design for me, which is like a lot of product design specifically, you have to be designing in a way that makes sense to engage with. There's a common phrase that my lecturers always threw around, which is, you don't notice good design, you only notice bad design. Something to that effect. And that really, like, when you've made something that uses really good design, someone's going to interact with it the way it's supposed to be interacted with and not notice, right? If you've ever seen a door that has a push bar across it and then it opens inwards, bad design, very bad, because you try to push it and then you feel like an idiot.
That's so true.
You only put a push bar on the direction that you push a door. That's good design because you see a thing and you're like, a touch, and then it works. So using sign language feels very similar to having those design concepts and communicating those kinds of things, because it's meant to be like super innate, super like conceptually consistent, and that is really satisfying. And I find that very similar to, I already forgot what the third kind of communication you said I have is.
Like verbal, so speaking from university, product design, so producing physical artifacts, and then also physically through sign language with your hands.
Yes, gotcha.
And face.
Yes. I find that the most similar when using spoken language is like it connects very directly to science communication almost, because like,
hell yeah,
you'll never guess. But because science communication is about having a conversation where everyone can participate, everyone understands the things that are being said in a way that science jargon like reduces your audience. It's like if you started giving a PowerPoint presentation on a design you did and you had no pictures on it. You're like, okay, you're kneecapping your audience's attention span right there. And it's only going to be people who can stand to sit there and listen to you talk for 10 minutes with no visual input whatsoever. I'm already off that list.
Me too, as someone who can't imagine things visually. Like, I'd be so gone.
There's an interesting discussion here about aphantasia that we're not having.
Yeah,
but
that's for another day. But like, we
Damn
should
it.
do a podcast episode about that.
Yeah, but I just can't see it happening.
I can see it for us. And then, yeah. Anyway.
Some visual-based puns for everyone.
Yeah, so I find it very similar to science communication in that way, but I do find spoken communication the most different. I am prone to waffling, as you may have noticed already.
No, how dare you?
And I find that I do that because I'm not convinced that someone understands what I'm saying, which, you know, sometimes is anxiety inducing. Sometimes it's just like, my friends know what I mean. But that's sort of the threshold where I find Auslan and like science communication sort of don't or experience less of that. And like design experiences less of that because if you're confident in your design or you're confident in the way you've signed something, you know that it's been understood the way it should be. Insofar as you can guarantee that with anything, with any language purpose anyway. But when you use the right signs, you know that you've been understood. And then if they're making a weird face at you anyway, something else has gone terribly wrong.
Can we touch on that a bit? I think, you know, it's very likely we might have some listeners who have never had like a 10-minute introduction to Auslan before or sign language. So signing includes way more than just hand gestures, right?
Yes. So this is if you ever study sign language, you will learn very quickly that it is not just your hands. There is so much grammar that occurs when you see interpretations of language in very limited circumstances. It looks very basic, which is not true at all. It's just the easiest way of showing people things is basic, because doing anything else requires a lot more explanation. So sign language has very, very complex grammar, and almost all of the grammar is actually in your facial expressions.
Whoa.
If you think about like, I don't know, for me in high school, people would be like, oh, you have like really stone face expression all the time. You can't do that in Auslan. Like, obviously there's some difference, but when you're learning it as a hearing person, there is no space for you to not express. You have to use all of the muscles at your disposal to communicate what you're saying, which I always think about in like, it must be difficult to have like a secret conversation across the room. You look upset, it's very obvious. But yeah, relating it to something everyone noticed during lockdown when we had interpreters on the news all the time, suddenly they were very, very visible. They can't wear masks. A lot of people commented that, that seems silly that like the one person here who's supposed to really be complying with this, you can't wear a mask when you're communicating professionally in sign language, because your grammar is on your face. And it's really important to communicating your point. It's not just, are you asking a question? You use it to finish sentences. You use it to ask an implicit question versus stating a fact, and to communicate like the structure of a sentence. Basically, you use a lot of like pausing and emphasizing with your face to make those subtle differences.
Yeah.
The way that you can hear a comma when someone is speaking. I use very few of them. I just don't stop. But if you can like hear a comma when someone is speaking, you get the same thing when someone is communicating with Auslan, where you can see a comma or a full stop. Insofar as those are relevant, they're not really, but you can very much see that grammar happening.
Wow. That's so interesting, because I always thought that it was just to complement like the hand signing.
Yeah,
I
right?
didn't realize that it was grammar.
Yeah.
Like, that's so cool.
It's so good. This is so much of what you start learning is like you learn how to finger spell just so that you can communicate functionally anything you want to say. You can spell it. But then you have to learn how to use your face, because otherwise you're never going to get a point across.
And is that across, do you think, I don't know how much knowledge you have of other sign languages, but is that generally across other sign languages as well, or is that like an Auslan thing?
It's definitely very common.
Okay.
a distinction we haven't pointed out yet is that ASL, commonly misunderstood to be Australian Sign Language. It's not. ASL is American Sign Language. Auslan is Australian Sign Language. Australian Sign Language is a sort of linguistic offshoot from British Sign Language, BSL, and ISL, Irish Sign Language. And we have a few, they've turned into like northern and southern differences based on where the missionaries came from that brought it over.
Yeah.
But certainly all of those have very similar premises. I don't know as much about ASL, but they definitely still use facial expressions. Having seen people use it, it's definitely still there. I don't know as much about like Brazilian Sign Language or Japanese Sign Language. It would make sense to me that they have a similar kind of structure, but I don't know how much their grammar relies on that or if they have like other methods.
So cool.
Yeah, that's
I
so
love
cool.
listening to you speak. It's so hard.
I just learned so much just then.
This is great. Ella's been hearing me waffle on about this for years. So
Yeah. Also hyping you up in the car. I was so excited to listen to you. You know so many cool things. And Bailey couldn't believe that they were like, I don't know, like had knowledge that we wanted to share
You have
with our
so
listeners.
much knowledge.
You're so
honestly.
cool.
Okay, I think that gives us a really good background and information for people who didn't know as much about sign languages before. I definitely learned a lot just then. So I think let's give people some more context and talk about some representations of sign in pop culture. And I think for this question, we mean real sign language. So like representations of Auslan, ASL, so on, because we will go into fictional forms a little later. So Bailey, you want to talk a bit about that?
real sign languages are so interesting. So the ones that come to my mind, there is a brilliant movie that had deaf people involved all the way up, is my understanding, called Unsound. Oh. It is a fantastic Australian movie about a deaf trans guy who is, he's trying to advocate for having this silent disco for deaf people, which is very cool. Mm-hmm. Just the coolest thing in the universe. It sounds, I just heard that and it sounds insane, but it's very cool. And he finds a hearing guy who's really, really sweet and helps him accept his queerness. But their connection comes with a lot of challenges because while I don't remember his name, but he primarily uses Auslan, he can lip read. I think he speaks like a very little bit because there's still like a lot of hearing people in his life. But that definitely presents some communication challenges, especially when his boyfriend is not good at deaf culture. And that's like a whole thing of itself that I'm not really qualified to speak on, but oh my God, it's so interesting. Watch that movie. It's great. There's also, there's a movie called CODA.
Yeah.
Which is, really, really cool. I haven't seen that one. It apparently is based on a French film called La Famille.
I can't remember the name of it, but that's the one that I've seen, and I know that they recently redid it.
Okay.
Because I think the first one, the French one, they didn't have deaf people involved in it. I think.
Okay,
but then this one did. So.
Yeah. That's neat. I tried to memorize the French name before recording. That one is apparently really, really good. That one is in ASL. There's also a couple of other things. Anyone who loves Marvel, the Hawkeye show, I have some opinions.
Oh, tell us your opinions.
Oh dear. Before I get into my like whole thing, other examples of it in popular media. There's an episode of Bluey, which Ella and I talked about, and I rewatched this morning just for like research purposes, and not because I love Bluey. As well as I know there's an anime. I don't know if it's currently coming out or if it was like coming soon. That uses Japanese sign language, which I'm so keen. I want to watch that. It's about a girl. You know what? I've forgotten the rest of the premise.
It's about a girl. That's all we need to know.
It's about a girl.
Relatable, right? There's also Eternals, another Marvel one.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Eternals. Is the deaf girl's name Pip or something? I don't remember. That might be a different character, but that was
just looked it up.
That was very cool. But yeah, Hawkeye. Back to Hawkeye. Mm-hmm. Boy, the opinions free flowing.
Let's go. Let's hear it.
So it's in ASL, which I know much less about, but my understanding is the grammar is still very similar, and also I know what signing looks like. And they had an interpreter for her, which is really cool. Because most of the characters in that film do not know Auslan. And there's a funny little gag about, it's not really a gag, about Hawkeye not knowing ASL, which is all well and good. There is some absolute kneecapping of their actor for Echo in that a lot of her signing, there is a time and a place to be focusing on the reaction of someone versus the person expressing. Totally fair. Every time they focus on her to get her expressing when she's signing, they do the same thing they do with a hearing actor, where they do like big close up on face, which is
And not showing hands.
that's dumb.
No.
Like they have so clearly done it for a hearing audience. And they're like, you don't know what she's saying. We can cut that out. No, she is expressing with her hands. It is so important you show the whole thing of what she is saying. You can't just like show her face expressing and some other guy saying it or like subtitles. You need to be able to see what she's saying in order to see what she's expressing. And it was so jarring to have like these close-up cuts between her face and Hawkeye's face and this random guy talking. That was so jarring, especially in bits where they're trying to highlight her independence, which is meant to be like oh my God, a deaf villain? Whoa, or antagonist. But yeah, it was really shocking to see that they didn't have respect for the language that they were using, that they were like, we don't need to show all of it. No, you do actually.
Now that you're saying this, I remember watching it and feeling like something was off, but
Well, there
now
you
I
go.
understand why.
Yeah.
You know, as a hearing person who doesn't understand all the complexities, but like you can still feel while watching it that it's
weird,
not
right?
because
Because
it's not happening the way that it should be.
Yeah, because you can see she's like, in the shots, you can see that she's like waving her shoulders around. So you know there's more happening that's been cropped out. And that makes it a really weird viewing experience at best.
So frustrating.
It's, oh boy. Comparatively, things like Bluey, absolutely just doing it right with these little like thumb-handed dogs. Like they don't have a lot of fingers, but they made sure that the signs they were using, having just watched it, the signs they were using are fairly comprehensible despite not having the dexterity of long fingers to express. And also they do a lot of pulled out shots. So they have to be very visible signs and they make sure that they are. That's very well done.
Come on, Disney.
Try harder.
Yeah,
Disney.
better. I know.
On
Company that has
every
more
front.
money as well, you would think.
Right?
I don't know.
It's, yeah, honestly, they did much better in Eternals. And that was like no far jump, but it was much better.
Yeah, so the actor in Eternals, that was Lauren Ridloff, and she was playing Makari, the deaf superhero.
Okay.
And we were just like tossing it around earlier. We were like, I forgot her name.
Yeah,
got it.
Yeah, I read about that in a conversation article when I was researching for this episode.
That's where I just pulled it from because you sent it to me.
Yeah, it's a really good article. Another movie that I think of is A Quiet Place. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen A Quiet Place. Isn't that a horror movie?
Yes,
Isabel
it is.
loves horror.
But
Oh,
I know.
dear.
But let me tell you, that one is, the premise of it is like a whole bunch of people have been wiped out by this kind of like alien sort of monster who finds you by sound. So if you make sounds, it like jumps on you and you just like dead. And it centers around this family who, and their daughter is a deaf person, and the actress is also deaf.
We
and
love
so
that.
the whole movie, how they communicate is through ASL.
Whoa.
And so ASL actually becomes critical to survival.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Highly recommend that movie.
That's very cool. I won't be watching it.
And they kept that going in the sequel too as well.
There's some really powerful scenes actually in the sequel when she's like, because the sequel at the start sort of shows the beforehand, what happened, how they got into that situation of all these people like being killed. And there's a really powerful scene in a car where the dad can hear everything that's going on outside and she can't hear. You get like her perspective as well, where there's no sound, and it's terrifying. But yeah, it's a really good, and I have heard people say that movie actually represents ASL quite well too.
That's neat. Yeah, there are some things that do it really well. On the note of another thing I just remembered, the Dragon Prince Netflix series. Oh my God. There is a best character, honestly. the the auntie of the princes who are the focus of the show. Her name is General Amaya. She is literally the head of the country's military, Catullus. Very, very cool. Highly recommend this series. She is deaf. She doesn't speak ever. And I just love the commitment to having a deaf character who doesn't speak, because I feel like there's a common thing where for drama, the same way that they will like have the big strong man cry to like make a point about sadness, they will sometimes make a point of a deaf character by at some point making them speak and like showing that they can't talk well or that their voice sounds different, which is common because shockingly, if you can't hear yourself, you will sound different. But she doesn't ever make noise, which is not realistic, but it is, I like the commitment of that.
Yeah.
She's fantastic. She can sign with her direct troupe. They actually understand her. They don't sign back, they talk. She obviously lip reads most of the time, but they understand her signing, which is fantastic. I believe it's in ASL. I can't speak to how accurate it is, but it looks fantastic. They're really, really good at replicating the signs clearly. And she is so independent. During a chunk of time when she isn't with her troupe, she's with other people, she does have an interpreter, Gren, who doesn't get a name for like 3 full episodes that he is in, which is such a nice way of communicating that he is there only to help her.
Yeah.
He's not a character for 3 episodes. I think it's 3 episodes. He is like at like the end of a conversation where we've like just had like a whole thing. She's like, and I will send Gren to the front line. Yeah. And then it like zooms in on him and he's like, oh, that's me. And that's when you learn his name. It's so good. But yeah, there's several really good moments where they focus on her. There's a scene where she is talking to her sister's grave that is not interpreted. Gren is not there. She is clearly signing to the grave and there are no subtitles. I had to look it up because I wanted to see what she was saying, but I love the commitment to the language of this character. It's absolutely fantastic. Brilliant. And they have the space to tell jokes because you can do that with any disability. Very important to be like, disabled people are not capable of humor. Incorrect. Yeah. It's so good. Yeah. That's top tier representation as far as I don't know anything about the actual replication of the signs.
Something I wanted to bring up there that I know you'll be very excited by is comedy. Because one of your favorite comedians, Adam Hills.
Yes.
Who
oh my God.
Is a disabled man. He has one full leg.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then one last leg, as the joke is.
Yeah.
But he normally has an Auslan interpreter at his shows.
And yeah, I don't know if it's always, but he did for like a specific tour, I think he did.
Yeah, but he has some really good interplay where he brings in the interpreters a lot of the time into the comedy and makes jokes with them or tells stories about how he found out about certain signs. And I really admire him, using his platform to talk more and bring people into the conversation. And the conversation, he's a comedian, it is a funny one. Like it's supposed to stories that connect people, make them laugh and go to humanize deaf people.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately is important.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I went to one of his toured shows that had an Auslan interpreter, as well as I have seen I think I have it on video, one of the same tour, but when he did it in Britain. So they have a BSL interpreter, which is so great. Like top tier, just that he knew it needed localization. That shouldn't be...
the bar is in hell.
Yeah, the bar is in hell. As just discussed with Hawkeye. Yeah, but I love those shows. There is an amount of like, this is a comedy show. We are here to make jokes about how signs can look inappropriate because this is a visual language. Yeah. And that is definitely not the tone for which you should be learning Auslan. But if it's your avenue for finding out about something, it is a good avenue, especially because he does it very respectfully. This is like a really common thing that no one knows, that if you have an interpreter obviously you need to have the people watching the interpreter quite close to the front or you're not going to be able to see anything. So there's like a section off to one side, whichever side the interpreter stands on generally, where you like place seats for deaf people. That's where like the allocation is for the signing interpreter, which is really good. But it does mean that for things like Hamilton, which is returning to Australia, and did have a few shows where they had interpreters when they were around 3 years ago. I don't even remember when I went. That's how long ago it was. I was gunning for that show for years, and I don't remember when I saw it.
Time isn't real.
Yeah, they had a few shows, and you might be thinking, wow, that's a rap musical. The interpreters must be bloody good, and you'd be right, because my lord, that's a lot of information to communicate in a very small space of time. But this is really important that, like, even when you have someone interpreting for your shows, you do actually have to know where to seat the people that are going to come to your show relevant to their disability. Like, people who have wheelchairs, those seats are often, like, in some sort of fronting row, so there's like extra walk space. And if you're gonna have deaf people at a sign interpreted show, you need to have a section right in front of the interpreter for those people to sit so they can see what's happening. I don't remember how I got here.
You're talking about Adam Hills.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. I love Adam Hills. He's great.
No, I think that was also, I love hearing like your knowledge. It's just, it's so like interesting. And I think on that note, how does sign language like Auslan deal with expert, including scientific words and knowledge? Like, what level of communication needs to occur? Because I remember we had a conversation last week about how there's no sign for something like solar system or even system.
Yes. So this is such an interesting topic. And occasionally when I've like had a conversation with people about sign language and then talked about something else like their degree or whatever, and they're like, how would you sign that? And I'm like, oh God, give me like 5 minutes. Because as you might imagine, there's not the variety of movements and hand shapes that there are of sounds you can make with your mouth, especially if other languages' sounds are included. But it's so interesting because you don't have like direct one-to-one sign to a word all the time. Especially for some words that like kind of mean nothing, like system. System kind of has a meaning, but it really requires other words to go with it to apply any meaning.
Yeah.
System on its own, you're like, something that moves maybe has multiple parts. Like, it's kind of an anything word. And there's a lot of that in English. But in sign language, they need to find other ways of communicating without those empty words. So there's not a word for system, but any important word that includes the word system isn't going to share anything because there's no direct word for system. So something like solar system, which I'm speaking to my experience that I don't know of a sign. I certainly haven't seen a universal one. When you're learning in a professional field, as a deaf person, there are a number of barriers with language and studying, and that's all very important. And I'm not the one to speak on those experiences. But when you have a group of deaf students learning together, they often do create signs for these very technical scientific words. Similar if you have deaf people who do study with an interpreter, who interprets all their lectures, they will often create some shorthand signs for frequently used words. Which are very individual and based on their own context.
So they can't be shared, like wider to a community. Because it's like a colloquialism rather than like a, hello, all of deaf culture, here is a word I made for you, oops.
Exactly, yeah. It's like when you try to use TikTok words to your parents. They're like, please stop saying skibbity.
Oh, no.
It's like when I try to explain which emojis mean what to my mother.
Oh, yeah.
Boy, that's a journey every time.
Love you, Sophie.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there is a lot of, I don't know what it's like in other languages. In Auslan, there is a very strong community aspect to the official design of new signs. Like COVID, that happened very rapidly, as did everything surrounding it. But the Deaf Connect, they recently, like 3 years ago, they changed what they were called. And it took like literally 3 years for the deaf community to decide on a new sign for it. because it is not, if you look it up, it's not literally the signs for Deaf Connect, because those words don't mean anything. The sign that they do have, the official community sign, is more related to what they facilitate to the community, which makes a lot of sense. But it took 3 years for that process to happen, and that's an organization that they work very directly with. Not everyone personally, but it's something that's very central to their life. So that should indicate, like, that's the kind of effort that goes into creating new signs that receive community acceptance. If you look it up, there is a sign for Australia that is not pick them up and put them over there, which is literally what the international sign for Australia is. It is pick them up and put them over there, kind of.
What?
Because convicts.
I've heard it.
English
Yeah.
convicts. Yeah.
I've heard it be described as a kangaroo bounce, but I'm pretty sure that explanation came
That's not
way
what it is.
afterwards.
Yeah. It is literally, like, referred to the English convicts. Which,
Wow, colonized language.
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my
Thank you,
God.
England, for that. Yeah, that one is not. It is frequently used. A lot of people in the deaf community still use it because there is not a community accepted alternative. There is a frequently used alternative that refers to the fact that it's one big land surrounded by ocean, which also and relates and actually directly references Uluru, which is great, but it wasn't created for the deaf community. I read a whole article about how it actually relates to other things and was created by 2 people in particular who are not great. So that sign, a lot of people are against it receiving like fully against it receiving community acceptance because it wasn't created under the right circumstances. So there's a lot of very specific procedure. That said, I just realized I've skirted around the very interesting question of, like, how does it handle technical words? Here's all of the periphery information surrounding that. The answer is it does SciComm, which is great. I love that. I love saying that. That felt so good. What an incredible tagline.
Oh my goodness, they're a psychoma.
Because if you're signing a word like solar system, generally if it's a new sign to you or to the person you're communicating with, you sign what the thing is and then you spell it so that you have something to refer back to. But that does mean that the spelling is like, you do spell in English, to be clear. There's not a secret other language here. You don't sign the thing and then just leave it there because you haven't solidified what the concept is. But you also can't just spell it because then you're not explaining the concept. And that's rubbish science. So it's really important that you use your hands to depict what the thing is, which is a large portion of how sign language works, is you depict things and then you spell it to make it clear that that's what this is called in English. And then if you want to refer back to it, you could fingerspell it again. Or if you're communicating with a small group that is like using concentrated language, you could shorten a way of signing it. I think there's technically a sign for atom, but it's not used because you need to explain what the hell that is before you can just go on talking about it.
Because not everyone has the context
Exactly.
to understand the sign. So even if you showed it to them and it was an accepted part of the Auslan vocabulary.
Exactly.
It doesn't serve the functional purpose.
No, and this is the great thing that you will love about it is that Auslan, because of that, is always science communication first. It's very much you have to explain the concept and make sure someone else understands the concept before you can continue anywhere. And that's like so important. And I love that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Lots of my classes were like, here's a relatively innocuous word / concept. Explain it to me. Tell me what this is. Like solar system. We also did rainbow, which does have a very good sign, and it's very obvious. But the teacher was
splitting
like,
it up into rain and bow isn't helpful.
no.
Because it doesn't communicate what a rainbow is.
Bow has absolutely nothing to do with the word rainbow. Rain has some, but it doesn't tell you anything about what it is. So you have to explain what a rainbow looks like, not necessarily the physics that goes into producing a rainbow, but you do have to explain the experience of a rainbow, of like the multiple colors it's in the sky, it's curved. You have to explain all those things in order for someone to understand what a rainbow is in sign language, which is not to say deaf people don't know what rainbows are.
No, but like a little kid maybe.
Exactly. You know, if a kid is like, what's a rainbow? You're like, it's that in English. That would be, you know, the kid's going to have more questions. But in sign language or in Auslan, you very much communicate the answers of those questions first.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that system. It's great. I have had so many questions just implicitly answered by signs. My favorite one is when our teacher was explaining to my class that a common English phrase, raining cats and dogs, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all know what that means. You don't sign that because someone's going to look at you sideways and be like, why are animals falling from the sky? Because that's what you've said. And because it's a very literal language, you can't use phrases like that. If you sign phrases, they're going to be like, what drugs have you been consuming?
What are they teaching the hearing people?
I think they might be doing it wrong. So you just sign that you make an expression and an exaggeration of the sign for rain to express that it is heavier, it is intense, it is a lot, those kinds of alterations, rather than using literal words or, God forbid, dumb English nomenclature.
Yeah, I love it. And when we were speaking about it the other day, I kind of had this revelation that in Auslan, because you give the description first and then, you know, the term, the jargon, the scientific long multi-syllable word that nobody wants to deal with, it's almost like Auslan is doing the work of psychom and of de-jargoning. Like for science, they just, you know, put all those terms in and like, deal with it. And then psychom has come along and we're like, take that word out, work out how to explain it to people. But Auslan does that inherently. So hype, so cool.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the way that we did that question with solar system, and a big part of it, obviously when you're using Auslan, you sometimes have to you have to explain things that are bigger than the space you're inhabiting. So you use visual features that sort of relate to the idea of zooming in or out. Which is so visual, right? To then be like, this little thing over here, make it bigger and let me explain it to you. Or here's Earth, let me zoom out so that we can see what's around Earth. And that's the kind of stuff you do. And that's so cool.
The context is so inherent and I love it. But conversely, so we've been talking about real depictions of sign language. Let's talk about non-real language. So we have in science fiction, we have Dune, the Book of Boba Fett, and there are lots of fictional worlds that have to come up with ways to talk about concepts that aren't real. And in sci-fi, this is known as technobabble, which I hear is something you care about.
Oh my God, so much.
So how does like non-real language differ from Auslan or like normal science slang / jargon?
Oh my God. Okay, so
the smile on Bailey's face is huge, by the way.
I'm so excited to talk about this. What I find really interesting is that technobabble serves a very specific function of cluing in the audience to a different kind of science going on. But it has to do that without just frankly, technobabble in movies should be better at science communication than scientists. Because you're trying to tell people that there is different science going on, not normal Earth science. There is something else happening. Whereas, like, a lot of the words we have in English that relate to science are not necessarily things that people understand. You can say them, but you then need to, in science fiction, differentiate yourself from potentially real science or relate to it in some way that is clear that it's not your science. This is our you're joining me on a little trip right now. And I love it so much. Fictional sign languages have been represented a number of different ways, not necessarily in the greatest light, but can facilitate really awesome storytelling. Like you were saying with using sign language in a horror movie to make the point of sound. Right? That's very cool. I haven't seen a whole bunch of examples in my own media consumption, but one that stuck out to me and was like top tier as far as I'm concerned was in Book of Boba Fett. I know Ella, you like Star Wars or something.
Star Wars girly.
I know some Star Wars things.
Fantastic. So, Tusken Raiders. Not a good As a character design, they were fairly racist in their inception. And as things go, we improve with time. So there's not a lot of remnants of that in Book of Boba Fett. They've tried to like do a lot of world building around them so that suddenly they're actually a complex race and not a caricature of an English guy's view on other cultures. And one thing they decided, because the only thing that we've known until Book of Boba Fett is that these Tusken Raiders scream a lot.
Same.
Very relatable. And they decided to make them use a sign language, which is very cool. And in the development of that, they actually included sign language users. I don't know who they were specifically, but they did use sign language users, people in the community, to help construct a sign language from the ground up that conceptually developed in the same way that sign languages do natively, which is so cool. That they picked signs like home and sun and day, things like that relate to the environment surrounding them, which is the desert. And there's dunes and the like sand around them. All has a very distinct connection to the way that they're communicating, which is so cool and so well done. That's top tier and like so respectful as developing of a fictional sign language could be, because you're respecting that communication type, which is so important. And the rest of the movie spends a lot of time, the rest of the series, where they're focused on, spends a lot of time showing the full body of signs where relevant. Please.
It's not that hard.
Please, Marvel, do better. Really demonstrating what the signs look like, which is just so cool. As someone who understands like what sign language looks like, I could see the communication that was happening, which was not something I expected. Despite that, like, I couldn't read it because it's not the same, but I could definitely see what they were having conversations about. Like, the way that it was constructed really made sense.
That's so cool.
I was so impressed. I was delighted that I was like, oh, that sign probably means some kind of day, like a time word. And I was right. And I was like, whoa, now that's well done, guys.
So do you think kind of in that way that if a fictional movie was like, here is a thing that does not exist in the earth, like on the earth, and therefore no earth sign language has a sign for it. How do you think that fictional world, creator, director, whatever type of form the storytelling takes place, how would they go about creating like language for it? Do you have to base it on something that we already understand? Can it be based on something that the character understands, but that we as viewers do not?
I think it depends on what you want the goal of the language to be. Because if, like in Book of Boba Fett, you want it to communicate more about this culture, it doesn't have to relate to things that we understand. You can build it on things we understand, like certain periods of time or certain structures that we like understand conceptually, like home or community, those kinds of things. But you definitely don't need it to be like, we have one sun in our solar system and you must as well. Like, they don't necessarily have to be relating to only concepts that we're like, yes, that makes sense. But at the same time, that's the job of like all technobabble in the end. And I would love to see like more creation, more like media that includes like sign language technobabble. Because there wasn't a lot in Book of Boba Fett, which makes sense. They're a fairly primitive species that live in like relatively small area of the world that they're on. So it makes sense that there wasn't like technobabble specifically.
But you just love to see it.
I'd love to see it. It would be so good. I'm sure there's like obscure Star Trek episode somewhere where they do something similar, but wouldn't necessarily be a good one. But yeah, technobabble is like such an important communication tool for creating fiction and communicating with your audience what's going on, that you can get so much more out of when you expand the mindset of the audience specifically. There's good and bad technobabble, guys. I need you to know this. Transformers, very bad. You can like those movies, but the technobabble is so bad. Don't add the word quantum.
Quantum woo.
No, sci-fi should be doing that anyway.
Sci-fi, don't.
I just get annoyed. I get annoyed as well every time that they do that. They're like, oh, how do you explain it? Quantum. And you're like,
shut up, man.
I know there's someone somewhere who would have a fight with me over this, and I would absolutely have it. But Doctor Who, of like New Who, but not all of it. Don't get me wrong, not all of it. Definitely consistently has pretty good technobabble, especially because they've constructed it. They've had a long time to be constructing technobabble. Same as a lot of Star Trek, a lot of Star Wars. They've had a long time to establish their specific brand of technobabble. Star Trek is like top tier on this for me, because sometimes when they like have issues with the warp core, as every Star Trek series does about every 3 episodes.
As I say, every 3 episodes, the warp core is...
The warp core, it's not starting, Captain. Can't get to boot up in the morning.
It needs its daily coffee.
Feet are horrific Scottish accents.
God, I love old Trek.
So the warp core is such a strong piece piece of Star Trek science that's rooted in like a long history of how we understand it works that, you know, changes every few episodes, but, you know, but they've had such a long time building up this concept of how it functions in a vague and esoteric way, that it comes across as fairly consistent at this point. If you're watching Star Trek Voyager, if you're watching like some of the newer stuff, Star Trek Voyager or Discovery, I love Discovery. Even Strange New Worlds, which is now my favorite Star Trek series ever. You can like see their problem solving steps surrounding the warp core. You can be like, oh, that tracks, which is a wild thing to say about
something that doesn't exist.
Sci-fi that's so deeply rooted in a future that doesn't exist. But there's so much going on that they've spent a long time building, and for me that makes really good technobabble. The fact that you can look at their problem solving and be like, yeah,
their problem solving that is something that we can do, but their problem solving specifically makes sense for the thing that they are trying to fix that does not exist in my world, but with my understanding of it, I would take similar steps too.
Exactly. It relates in some ways to the idea of hard and soft magic systems, which is a whole different conversation that I would love to have on another day.
Just do a PhD.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been slowly over the course of a few months being like, hey Bailey, you could do a PhD.
You'd already convinced me to do a master's, and then that master's program folded, and now you're just like, take the next step.
I think you could do it, and I'd love to read your dissertation.
Oh my God. Have I mentioned I can't write?
Text to talk, baby.
I would hate to see what a computer would generate trying to read this and write it down.
So something else I wanted to touch on is there's another kind of long tradition in sci-fi, and there's someone at ANU who specializes in this too, Gemma King. And this tradition in this tradition in sci-fi movies is of humans signing to communicate across species, so to communicate with apes. So that's movies like Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and that sort of thing. And I think King Kong as well.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's based on American Sign Language. I don't know how
most likely
good it is though. But I think there's something interesting here about using sign to communicate across species.
Yes, that's super interesting because I don't know if we're going to come back to this at some point, but similar to a recent mum talk trend is teaching little kids sign language, which very cool, big fan. But there's definitely a lot to be said for the idea that like when you don't share like the same vocal cords, it's very helpful to have other kinds of communication. There's different kinds of communication with dolphins happening right now where they like record and get them to press buttons, which is so cool.
But for apes that have, opposable thumb and
Yes.
share our, dexterous fingers.
Yeah, yeah.
Sign language seems a very obvious
Yeah,
communication route.
It's a really good way to go for like cinema purposes. And I think it's most likely a lot of these movies do tend to use ASL just because they're generally based in America. King Kong, it's possible uses Japanese, but I'm not sure. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense to use sign language when you can't like articulate vocally in a similar way, because we receive a lot of communication visually. Anyway, we receive a lot of emotion. We receive a lot of like social cues and emotional cues visually that we know that animals can detect. So using a sign language, brilliant. Like, absolutely perfect. Especially with, I believe in real life they use sign language with some animals when training.
Is silverback gorillas? I don't know.
I just know those are the dangerous ones. But
Their hands are so big.
I mean, well, it relates a lot to the fact that handlers for different animals have used hand signals for a long time. Like, not the best example, but like SeaWorld and stuff. When they,
I knew you were going here.
I know, I know. I'm sorry.
You said not the best example, and I was like, "Here's SeaWorld."
But the handlers do use like hand signals with animals. We know that that's a kind of communication. And not to get the wrong idea that this is like, oh, it's the same as sign language. No. Definitely not. No. But like, it reinforces that idea that we're very capable of taking in a lot of very specific information visually. Sign language is just capitalizing on that. It's great. It's also fantastic, as a side note, if you are auditorily overstimulated. You can just not talk. It's fantastic. As someone whose partner started learning sign language too and can like spell, absolutely top tier. If I just don't want sound, that's an option and it's great.
I fear you have become godlike in your powers.
Oh my god. I would just download sign language for everyone, which I'm sure deaf people would as well. That'd be pretty cool. But
yeah, that'd be actually quite helpful.
Do you think we're cyborgs? Just download the language.
I can fix it if you're not. Why do you think I learned technobabble?
Oh my goodness.
I don't know if that's too sinister for this podcast.
Look, we've spoken about organ transplants across species before, so
we did.
Great. Great stuff.
That was our darkest episode.
I don't remember that episode.
It's not the best. Doesn't have our best listenership.
No.
I guess, to kind of wrap up all these gorgeous discussions we've had around different languages, fictional, non-fictional, ways we can communicate an idea, ways we can story tell. I think a really important point that makes me really excited to kind of conclude with is the accessibility of communication. And we kind of spoken it a bit before. We've got sign language being used as a communication tool for babies who don't have their vocal cords, mature enough for a while to be able to communicate verbally. But we've seen kind of a growing trend online of people who are teaching their babies sign language to communicate the baby's needs, which is amazing.
It works so well.
It works so well.
No doubt.
And gives babies this sense of agency and autonomy that, I wouldn't normally ascribe to a baby, but you give them the tools for communication and all of a sudden it becomes accessible to them.
If a creature can't communicate with you in a way you perceive, you're going to think that it just isn't capable of wanting things.
Yes, yeah.
But if it can communicate, suddenly it wants a lot of things.
Yeah. And I'd love to touch on, I guess, like the ability of different ways of communication and how they help people across cultures. So in the article Isabel and I were talking about earlier, we have the director of Parasite talking about as soon as you can overcome the little 3 centimeter gap of having to have text translation on screen, as soon as you can get closed captions in your movie, all of a sudden your movie can be international in the language that it was recorded in. And, as soon as we have visibility of deaf characters on screen, such as in Bluey, one of the world's most popular children's TV shows right now, not just for kids. Yeah, really just making sign language visible and accessible and real to people who it doesn't necessarily impact in their day-to-day lives. Like all of a sudden these barriers come down the more different communication goes across different cultures.
Yes. I know that captions are not like aesthetically fantastic. And they do have their limitations, which is why you do not necessarily captions on TV. And it's a lot of people are like, just caption like the COVID broadcasts and stuff. It's not good. I watched those with captions. They're not good.
Live captioning is
full
of mistakes.
Yeah, especially now that we have computers do it. It was better when people were doing it. It was a little slower, not worse. It's so interesting though, because I feel like a lot of different like media presentations are kind of afraid to like give you a form of communication that you're not benefiting from. And I know you get people who complain about having captions on movies and stuff, but those people are dumb. As someone who frequently cannot pay attention to a movie if there's captions running, it's silly to complain about a form of communication that's not for you. I've been playing the second Spider-Man game, which is absolutely fantastic. And so much of the conversations going on in that game between Miles and his mum specifically is bilingual. They have conversations that like flux between English and I assume Puerto Rican. That would make the most sense to me. And that's fantastic. I love that. I love hearing it. It expresses their closeness with that community and that language, which is an inherent part of Miles as a character. And you as a viewer are learning stuff from hearing that communication happen. So it feels silly to not want to express what you can just by including other communication styles in media. And of course, once you get past the barrier of like, I don't want to have captions, or I don't want to create something with these accessibility improvements, you make it more difficult for yourself in the long run to do things. This is a very niche thing. I really like kinetic typography, which is a way of making text like an entertaining art form.
So it's where the words kind of move around.
Yeah, the words
they
captions.
have movement and form.
Yeah, it's captions that express more of what's going on than just the words, which is brilliant. I really enjoy it for listening to like snippets of podcasts and stuff. It's delightful. And I really recommend just going on YouTube and typing kinetic typography and seeing what comes up, because there's a lot of really funny skits that are just built on so well by the way that these captions are done by these creators. I would love to see that come out more in professional media, especially like it relates in some ways to the Into the Spider-Verse movie. I really like Miles Morales. Into the Spider-Verse having the like comic book captioning pop-ups that, as well as the onomatopoeia that comes up throughout the film that expresses more about what's going on than just there was a sound. And that's great, and I want more of that. I would love to see versions of it that lean more on kinetic typography than just like comic book stylization, because I think you could do some really interesting things, especially then because those things have like one less language barrier of like, you can read it. And obviously you still end up with some barriers of like how easy it is to read, as well as just how easy it is to see. I've been on too many websites that put green text on
a yellow background.
I can't read it. I don't expect colorblind people to. I can't. So you're always going to end up with barriers in some places, but if you actually are thinking about it, you can create such cool media.
Yeah, and I guess kind of what you were saying is with kinetic typography, that is an improvement on an accessibility function.
Exactly.
That doesn't take away from the original media. It actually adds to it because there's been enough thought put into it.
Yeah, and then people who simply can't hear what's going on aren't losing so much. If you can like, in some kinetic typography I've seen where there's like applause in the background, there's like a JPEG of just like an audience that's been cut out and they just like shake it on the screen a bit to give the impression of like, wah! And that communicates that there's audience cheering without just saying applause in black. Like
it gives it like a tonality and a lifelike quality.
Yeah, it actually communicates more of what's going on. And I think that's fantastic. And obviously then you're not people who are deaf that can't hear what's happening are still receiving almost the same amount of information. And that's really cool. I also do want to touch on the thing you're saying about teaching babies sign language, because I have opinions on this as well. And if you want to find someone that's doing this right and in a cool way and actually sharing their language with their child, I would recommend Jessica Kellgren-Fozzard, I think is how that name is said. She's a YouTuber. She is deaf and disabled and has a son with her wife. And they are raising their son to be bilingual. He speaks English and knows BSL, which is really cool because they take him to the park and sometimes there will be a noise. And Jessica wears hearing aids most of the time, so she doesn't primarily communicate in BSL is my understanding, but she does know it. But when they're at the park, and she probably is still wearing hearing aids, her son will like tell her the noises that are happening without any prompting, which is adorable. He like understands that she can't always hear things. Yeah. But he was also communicating that he needed to have his nappy changed before he was 2 years old. Like he was like, hello, I need the bathroom now. And they only taught him the sign for we are changing your nappy. They taught him the sign of we are changing your nappy and nothing else. And he learned on his own, oh, my body's doing the thing that it does when you change my nappy. Can you please take me to the bathroom? And it took them a while to figure out that's what was happening. And that's really cool. He
was like, I got to toilet train my parents.
Yeah, like, that's so cool. I don't actually know what the normal period is of kids knowing how to do that. But it was like really early, long before he spoke, he was like, I need my nappy changed, which is insane. But one thing that is very important to consider, A, when you're watching these videos, and B, if you're going to do it, is the way that a lot of these parents talk about baby sign. Not a thing. Not a thing. And I have a gripe because you are teaching a baby sign language. With whatever language you are using, make sure you're using the same one all the time would be my only premise of like, make sure it's Auslan or ASL or BSL.
Don't mix the three up.
Don't mix them up because a lot of people do, especially a lot of people in Australia, which is an understandable mistake, but common frustrations. But baby sign is like a condescending way of putting down this method of communication. You're just teaching your baby sign language. It's not going to look the same. It's never going to look the same. A child doesn't sound the same as an adult when they learn to speak. A good example is the Auslan sign for milk, which is pretty reminiscent of miming milking a cow. So when a baby learns this, what they often do to replicate it is just the act of repeatedly opening and closing their fist. That's the part of the sign that they are able to understand and reproduce when they learn it. That's the bit that rubs off the quickest, which makes sense. It's not a difficult motion and it's very comprehensible. So it works, so they keep doing it. So it makes it easy for babies to ask to be fed more. The fact that they're reproducing an imperfect sign doesn't make it baby sign. It's just a child learning sign language. That's what it looks like when deaf kids learn sign language.
The same way like an English baby would say uh-oh before you say yellow.
Yeah. I said my sister's name wrong for many years because I didn't understand like how it's pronounced properly. So I just said like my baby version of it. That's just
but
what
we're not
babies
speaking
do.
baby English.
No, we don't teach babies baby English.
Yeah.
We teach babies English and they are babies.
Yeah. So I guess like it's really important to focus on uplifting the community rather than putting them down when you step into their space.
Yeah, and recognizing that you are stepping into their space, because I feel like a lot of the time it's used to distance yourself from the deaf community as a way of like, oh, I don't want to get in trouble for this. You're not going to get in trouble for teaching your baby sign language. That can only be a good thing, especially if it helps add communication to someone's repertoire. That's only ever going to be a good thing. But it is important that you acknowledge, A, not your language. You can still teach your kid but not your language, and that you are receiving this information from somewhere that needs to be acknowledged. If you're going to tell other people to do it, tell them that your resources are like from the deaf community. Make sure you're learning it from someone who is a CODA or a SODA, which are kids and siblings of deaf adults. People who actually know what they're talking about, not the latest influencer who's like read all of the dictionary. Dictionaries for sign languages are not good. because language changes, funnily enough. And by the time languages are written down, by the time signs are written down, they've probably changed. They change very quickly. That said, it's also just hard to keep a record of them because it has to be in video form. Yeah, always remember where you are getting this information from and acknowledge the community that you are
benefiting from.
Thank you, yes. Which is what you guys do on the podcast as like science communicators, which is great.
Oh, so good. And such a good place to wrap up this episode.
Yeah, that was, I learned so much in this episode, and I think our listeners also would have learned so much. So I think let's turn to some questions for our audience. I would love to know what they learned about sign language today, and also maybe other representations of sign language, fictional and non-fictional, on screen.
Someone who knows, tell me about Dune. I really want to know. I haven't seen it, haven't read it. I really want to know what it's like in that.
Hit us up on our socials, on Instagram, even on Spotify now, Mastodon, Twitter,
LinkedIn.
And LinkedIn.
We're in a lot of places.
Let us know. Let Bailey know.
Yeah, sci_burst. And that brings us to the final question that we're asking all of our guests this season. So, Bailey, would you like to give 3 pieces of media as recommendations to our audience?
I was so excited for this question. First piece of media, which is not on topic whatsoever. Watch Megamind. That movie has aged like a fine wine. It is literally my favorite movie. It's so good. Please just watch Megamind. It's so good. It's absolutely bizarre to watch in 2024. It's great. Absolutely fantastic piece of media. The second one that I wanted to recommend, in no particular order, is This Is How You Lose the Time War. I don't remember the writers' names. There's 2 of them. It is a fantastic novella. It's literally your enemies to lovers dream.
Mwah.
It's so good. The entire thing is written in prose, which is, it feels like such an emotional read for something that is steeped heavily in sci-fi. It's absolutely fantastic. And just not like any other sci-fi piece of media I've ever experienced. It's absolutely fantastic. And the third one I want to recommend, which is not the one that I was planning on, I've forgotten, but top tier recommendation anyway, would be Star Trek New Worlds. It's fantastic. You don't need to know anything about Star Trek to enjoy it. It's such like old-timey sitcom sci-fi. It's absolutely great. And Picard is just like a dad, not Picard, that's the wrong one. Pike, thank you. Pike is just like a dad looking after his kids. It's absolutely great.
Woohoo!
Woo!
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This was great fun.
Oh, thanks for coming.
Isabel, I'm going to talk your ear off on the way home.
That's honestly so fine. Oh, that was such a good episode.
It was.
Thanks for coming on again, Bailey. And thank you, listeners. As always, stay nerdy, and we'll see you next time. Thank you to ANU CPAS for their support and access to their podcast studio.